Let's step out of the ivory tower of abstract economic theory for a minute and walk straight onto the factory floor. In this explainer, I want you to look at me as a firm manager, a business operator whose actual job is to sit at a desk, stare at spreadsheets, and decide exactly what you pay at the register. We're going to pull back the curtain on how prices actually get set in the real world and discover why the traditional stories we've been told about inflation are, well, kind of getting it all wrong. Let's dive right in.
Now, if you were anywhere near the internet back in 2020, you probably remember the famous money printer go brrr meme, right? It's funny, but it perfectly captures this mainstream macroeconomic myth that's been hammered into our heads for decades in Econ 101. The idea that printing money just automatically, magically creates inflation. The public, Wall Street, even mainstream economists, they generally take it as an absolute given that if the Federal Reserve fires up the money printer, prices everywhere will just skyrocket. But as someone who actually sets prices for a living, I've got a secret for you. The money printer has almost absolutely nothing to do with it.
Seriously, listen to this shocking admission from Daniel Tarullo. He's a former Federal Reserve governor. He basically admits out loud that the very people whose entire job is to manage inflation, they don't actually have a working theory of inflation dynamics. None. They're flying the economic plane completely blind. So to me, this tells us we need to throw out those old textbook macroeconomic theories. We desperately need a new perspective. And honestly, that perspective starts right here at the manager's desk.
There is just a massive, massive contrast between the textbook and reality. On one side, you have the textbook macro view, the quantity theory of money. It uses this fancy equation, MV equals PQ, and it basically treats the economy like a giant hydraulic plumbing system, where pumping in more money just automatically forces prices up. But then, you have the micro view, the daily reality of my desk. Central bankers do not set prices, abstract macroeconomic forces don't set prices. Human business managers do. And we do it based on a very, very simple formula. Our real costs plus our desired markup equals the final price.
And that brings us to a massively important concept, administrated prices. Look, prices don't just magically float up and down based on some invisible hand. They are administered. They're set consciously by me, the manager, through a highly deliberate accounting procedure. Setting a price is, at its core, a human decision made to ensure a business actually survives to see another day.
Let's think about a simple $12 price tag. When you see $12 on a shelf, you might think, oh, that item is inherently worth $12. But a price isn't some natural law we discovered out in the woods like gravity. $12 is a highly specific number that we, the firm managers, actively chose to count up to. It's just a unit of account. We picked the number 12 because that is exactly how much money we need to collect from you to hit our strategic objectives and, quite frankly, just cover our bills.
Walk through this simplified business ledger with me for a second so you can see exactly how we get to that $12. Let's say, to make our product, I get a supplier invoice for $5 worth of raw materials. Then I pay my employees $3 in direct labor to actually build the thing. That's $8 in base costs, right? Well, to stay in business and hopefully grow, I need a profit markup of $4. 5 plus 3 plus 4 equals 12. Setting pricing isn't magic, it is literally just basic survival math for a firm manager.
When I sit down in a pricing meeting with my team, the things on the whiteboard are pretty grounded. We're looking at supplier invoices, wages, profit targets, our production capacity, and customer goodwill. You know what is literally never discussed in our boardroom? The total M2 money supply. I mean it. We couldn't care less what the Federal Reserve is doing with interest rates when we're trying to price a specific batch of widgets. We only care about our direct, tangible costs.
Okay, so how do actual widespread price hikes happen? Well, it all comes down to a ripple effect. I like to call it passing the leaking bucket. Imagine a fire line of people passing a bucket of water. Suddenly, bam, a hole is punched in the bucket. Water, which represents our profit margin, starts leaking out. The person holding the bucket can't fix the hole, so to keep from losing absolutely all their water, they quickly pass it to the next person. In a supply chain, when a massive physical shortage hits and raises costs, firms pass that leaking bucket down the line to each other in the form of price hikes, until it finally lands right on the consumer.
Here's the exact step-by-step process of how that leaking bucket eventually lands on my desk. Step 1. A biophysical shock occurs. Maybe it's a drought, maybe it's a global microchip shortage. Step 2. The direct supplier tries to just absorb that initial financial loss. But Step 3. The shortage drags on way too long, and that supplier is forced to raise their price just to survive. Boom, I get an email that my raw material costs just spiked 20%. So Step 4. Because my cost just went up, my survival math changes. I am literally forced to raise our final price to you. Now, it's absolutely vital to understand the delicate balancing act we managers play here. On one side, we have absorbing costs. As managers, we absolutely hate raising prices. Why? Because it burns customer goodwill. If a shock is just temporary, we will eat the loss to keep you coming back. But on the other side is passing costs on. If a supply chain disruption is prolonged and massive, we literally cannot absorb it anymore without going bankrupt. Prolonged supply chain failures completely force our hands.
Which brings us to the absolute nightmare scenario for a firm manager. In supply chain logistics, we call it the bullwhip effect. Economists looking from the outside often mistakenly call this demand pull inflation, and they love to blame it on consumers having too much money in their pockets. But let me tell you, from the inside of the supply chain, it looks incredibly different.
Trace this timeline with me to see the compounding panic of the bullwhip effect in action. Let's say in week 1, there's just a 10% unexpected spike in retail demand. By month 1, retailers start panicking about running out, right? So they overorder by 20%. By month 3, distributors see this surge and order 40% more buffer inventory from manufacturers. And by month 6, upstream factories are completely overwhelmed by massive phantom orders. It's just like a flick of a wrist creating a massive cracking wave at the end of a bullwhip. A tiny shift in retail demand creates sheer chaos upstream.
And what does all this chaos do to my firm? Oh, it triggers severe financial consequences. Our production bottlenecks get strained to the absolute breaking point. We face massive risks of holding huge piles of unsold inventory if that phantom demand suddenly vanishes. We have to pay drastic premiums for emergency raw materials and overtime labor. All of this massively drives up our internal costs, putting crushing pressure on my desk to administer higher final prices just to survive the madness.
So, what's really happening here? It's simple, actually. Demand pull inflation is usually just cost push inflation with extra steps. Excessive consumer demand doesn't cause inflation because there are, quote, too many dollars chasing too few goods in some abstract macroeconomic vacuum. No, it causes inflation because an unexpected surge in orders fundamentally breaks our fragile supply chains. It creates massive bottlenecks, which forces our internal costs up, which then forces us, managers, to administer higher prices.
If we really want to find the true drivers of widespread price increases, we have to look at physical reality. We're talking about biophysical input shortages, like a lack of semiconductor chips or severe bad weather. We're talking about balance of payments crises, making imports wildly expensive. And, of course, the bullwhip effect causing total supply chain panic. Widespread inflation originates in specific, broken industrial sectors experiencing massive cost spikes. It does not originate from a government money printer.
I really want to bring this whole narrative home by leaving you with this incredibly powerful thought. Inflation is a phenomenon not of money, but of prices. And prices are always administered by someone. Inflation isn't some natural disaster, and it isn't an invisible economic gas filling the room. It is a cascading series of conscious human pricing decisions made by managers who are operating under extreme, real-world supply chain pressure. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative question. If inflation is actually driven by broken supply chains, skyrocketing input costs, and human survival pricing decisions, why do we constantly try to fix it by having central bankers tweak interest rates and manage the money supply? Honestly, it's kind of like trying to fix a leaking pipe in your basement by changing the radio station upstairs. So, the next time you see prices rising, don't look at the money printer. Look at the supply chain. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.